Good evening. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Bellingham and Whatcom County, welcome to the second event in our series, Toward a More Perfect Democracy. This series was developed and is being presented through the collaborative efforts of the League of Women Voters, the Ralph Monroe Institute for Civic Education, the Whatcom Museum, Whatcom Community College, and the City of Bellingham. It's been an absolute pleasure working with these remarkable partners to design this program, to almost launch it back in March, and then to regroup and figure out how to make it all happen anyway in spite of being quarantined during a pandemic. We'll remember 2020 for a lot of reasons. But we persevered in this effort because we all believe in this project. We believe it will offer you, our viewers, an opportunity to expand your understanding of the way our nation has struggled and continues to struggle to live up to our democratic ideals. By understanding our past, we are better prepared to face the challenges ahead. By listening to each other, we gain a more comprehensive understanding of our society and what we need to do to realize that more perfect democracy to which we all aspire. Now, the League of Women Voters was actually created 100 years ago, and the purpose was to ensure that women would have the information necessary to make informed choices when they cast their ballots. The League does not endorse any political party or any candidate. However, we work hard to ensure that all issues are clear, that the background and policies of candidates are understood, and that all citizens have access to the ballot and have a voice in this democracy. The League also studies issues and works to identify policies that offer the best hope for resolving the challenges we face as a community. And then we advocate for those policies, and we make our voices heard in the halls of government. This year, 2020, we commemorate not just 100 years of the League, but also the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. As we all know, the 19th Amendment did not ensure that all women actually had access to the ballot. That struggle for universal suffrage and political voice for all Americans is an ongoing struggle in which the League of Women Voters is engaged to this day. If you're interested in learning how you can get involved, please go to our website. Everyone is welcome in the League, even men. And at the end of today's program, I'll let you know more about the exciting third event in our series and a little bit about some of the other offerings coming up in the future. And now I would like to introduce the Executive Director of the Ralph Monroe Institute, Dr. Domani Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a professor of political science at Western Washington University, co-founder and former chair of the Whatcom Human Rights Task Force, and recipient of the Howard and Rosemary Harris Lifetime Peacemaker Award, and one of my favorite local heroes, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you for that nice little introduction, Judy. Before we go any further, let me just do a land acknowledgement. As we are just one day past Indigenous Peoples Day, it's never more appropriate than now to do this kind of acknowledgement. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin and throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude to our indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. When the Monroe Institute was asked to collaborate and take part in the 100th anniversary of the passage of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, I talked about this jokingly last week for those of you who may have been on board. I was Jill Bernstein's skills of persuasion are well known. And I also knew people like Judy Hopkinson, Annette Holcomb, and so forth, because my wife, Rebecca Johnson, worked with all of you all and still does when she was president of the League. And it was very easy for me to say yes to this exciting opportunity and collaboration, particularly because the Monroe, under Ralph Monroe's leadership, was when the state of Washington, Ralph Monroe, some of you may not know, was a 20-year Secretary of State of Washington, and it was under his leadership that we started to make access to voting ever more accessible. And he planted the idea of mail-in voting, which of course we've had for many years in this state, as the rest of the country is struggling now to learn how to do it. So this is very fitting for the Monroe Institute to be co-sponsoring this program. Our mission has to do with civic education, educating not only the campus community, but the broader community about the ways in which our political system works. So this, as I said before, is just an excellent opportunity, and we were happy that we were able to reschedule this series of programs about a more perfect union. We'll miss the early morning coffees at the crack of dawn with the ladies from the League, but we'll have an opportunity to hopefully do that at a more sane time, going forward, and when we're just trying to socialize a little bit. Let me thank the Political Science Department at Western Washington University, our chair, Amira Betty, and company for the continuing support for the Institute that you have displayed over these years that I've been director. I also want to make sure that I thank Vicki Choi, who along with myself and Kate Destler, our moderator tonight, was at many of those early morning coffees when the planning for these events was taking place. Let me just mention a housekeeping matter here before we go any further. Now, if you have any questions, you can click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and then that will be funneled to somebody who's working with Kate, and that individual will then pass those questions along to her. And it may not be that we can get to all of them, and she'll do her best to kind of group questions that are, coming from the same sort of area together, so that we can try to get to as many of your questions and your concerns as possible. Now let me introduce our moderator. Catherine Destler is an associate professor of political science at Western Washington University. Her teaching and research interests include education policy, civic engagement, public management, and the relationship between formal policy and values, norms, and behavior. She has published research in the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, International Public Management Journal, the American Review of Public Administration, and Economics of Education Review. Destler was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship from the National Academy of Education and the Spencer Foundation to examine the links between increased school choice and stratification by race and by income. She has also written for and consulted with practitioners, including the Seattle Public Schools. A former middle and high school English teacher, Destler holds an AB in comparative literature from Brown University, an MAT from the University of Virginia, and a PhD in public policy and management from the University of Washington. So Kate, with that, take it away.
Thank you. And I will echo Domani's enthusiasm and Judy's enthusiasm and our excitement that after a number of months of quarantine, we're able to come together and have a conversation. I'm really excited about today's panel. Those of you who were here last week know that we focused a lot on barriers to participation and the very real challenges, both historic and contemporary, that have led to unequal access to the vote and unequal franchise. Today, we will focus, the title of our talk is Making Our Voices Heard. And while keeping all of those challenges in mind, our focus will be on trying to understand ways in which individuals and groups of individuals who have historically been excluded from the political system can in fact achieve voice and make a difference. I'm really excited about our panel today, which combines 4 individuals who have both impeccable academic credentials, but more importantly, really rich experience in making change on the ground. And I will introduce each one of them in turn alphabetically. So starting off, Professor Larry Estrada is Emeritus Director of American Cultural Studies and Associate Professor Emeritus of Social Theory and Comparative Cultural Studies at Fairhaven College here at Western Washington University. As a scholar, Professor Estrada has written extensively about education, cultural studies, and more recently, immigration and economic exchange between the US, Mexico, and the Caribbean, Professor Estrada also has on-the-ground experience in politics, having, in a previous version of his life, served as mayor at Fort Collins, Colorado. We're so excited to have you back, at least virtually on campus with us here at Larry. Next, Sahar Fathi is the Policy Director of the Washington State Attorney General's Office. Prior to this position, she served in government at a number of levels, working both as a senior analyst in the Washington State Legislature and as a senior advisor and administrator in the city of Seattle. Sahar was named one of the smartest people in Seattle politics by The Stranger in 2013, and one of, quote, Seattle's smartest global women by the Seattle Globalist in 2014. A lawyer by training, Sahar Fathi has been heavily involved in nonprofits and in advocacy groups that promote immigrant rights and facilitate immigrants' political voice in the system. Next, we have Julie Sa'Leit'Sa Kwina Johnson, who's a member of the Lummi Nation with 30 years experience working for Native governments and organizations at the regional and the national level. She served 2 terms as a governor-appointed member of the Peninsula College Board of Trustees, including a term as chair, and has also served on the Northwest Indian College Board of Trustees. More recently, Johnson has served as an elected committeewoman of the Clallam County Democrats, the chair of the Native Americans Caucus of the Washington State Democrats, and the co-chair of the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians Native Vote. For the past 25 years, Johnson has been organizing a, quote, honoring lunch for Native women in Washington, D.C. during the National Congress of American Indians Conference. Finally, last but certainly not least, Professor Melina Juarez Perez joined Western Washington University in the fall of 2019 with a dual appointment in political science and women, gender, and sexuality studies. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of New Mexico, and her work focuses on the intersections of class, gender, race, and sexuality, and their role in shaping the lived experience, health, and happiness of Latinx and queer people of color. Her work has been published in a number of journals, including the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Policy Studies Journal, and the Journal of Health, Politics, Policy, and the Law. Her current research agenda focuses on the confluence of immigration and criminal justice systems. Perez's work also seeks to expand the use of community-based participatory research and critical pedagogies in the social sciences. I'm so excited to have you all here for a conversation. So I'll start by, in fact, in some ways, opening up with a question that may seem incredibly obvious, right? This past summer, after, in fact, we had invited you all to different iterations of this panel, we've witnessed a resurgence of direct action in cities and towns across the United States, sparked initially by the killing of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. Just briefly, if we think about this as an opportunity for, quote, expanding our voice or making our voices heard, what is there to celebrate, if anything, in this action? And are there concerns that you have? I'm going to turn to let each of you in turn use this as a moment to open the conversation. Larry?
You know, as I think about this particular question, the thing that I am very optimistic about is that I saw this as a very multiracial, multi-gendered expression by multiple groups of people in terms of injustice. And that's not to say that in the past there has not been, obviously protestations of injustice, but this was a very diverse grouping of individuals that had come together, that were sick and tired of witnessing the oppression that's been leashed upon people of color in general. And so that, in many respects, makes me very optimistic about what has happened post the murder of George Floyd. That's not to say that things need to go further. Obviously, they do need to go further. But I think it has given a great deal of momentum to various groups working together, unified, to bring about change in this country.
Thank you. Sahar.
I think from my end that the way I sort of see this as an opportunity is that it is our moment to really stop and finally lift up Black voices and listen to them and grow that movement. And I am optimistic that we are reorienting ourselves towards a democracy that centers itself on undoing racism, and that we are at least opening our eyes to the democracy that we could and probably should be. I think, to be ever cynical, the concern I have is that that people might think that the work is done with one election, that there may no longer be urgency after the election, and that we might become complacent or have fatigue after just a few months. And that this is really, the way we should be thinking about this is a marathon, that this is not a sprint, right? We're undoing centuries of oppression, and that takes a lot of hard work. And I think for me, that is really just the concern that I would underlie, not trying to bring down the optimism that is certainly there.
Thank you. It's always good to have a little bit of cynicism or a little bit of, to balance out any hope. Too much hopeful feelings never motivates too much political action. Julie.
Well, I agree with what the past two speakers stated. But when I looked at the demonstrations in Portland and Seattle, I thought of two words, and that's equitable treatment. And that's what people want. I don't care what color they are or where they're from. That's what we all want, is equitable treatment.
Thank you. Melina?
Hi, thank you. First, thank you so much for inviting me to this space. I really look forward to the discussion. And yeah, just like how other folks have been saying, the multiracial, multi-gender aspects of the movement, that diversity in the movement, but also the ideas about, the worry about complacency and thinking about equitable treatment. But what I also think about that brings me joy and celebration is thinking through not just voices as, the demands or the opinions of Black folks, of Native folks, of all the folks on the street, but also really thinking through about how liberation and freedom requires more than just listening to our voices. It really requires this holistic reformulation of the structures of society, all the relationships that have been silencing those voices historically, but that continue to limit them through cooptation, commercialization, and through just literally killing us, right? It's not just killing us through batons and bullets, but through the denial of basic rights like housing, healthcare, clean water, and air. And so when I think about these voices, it brings me back to everything that comes with them, everything that the voices are trying to tell us, not just, we can't just be concerned with expanding the voices, with listening to the voices, but actually taking action around what they are saying. And so one of the aspects that I've been really focused on is, for example, the discussions around the spiritual aspect of these movements. So thinking through, for example, scholars like Natalie Avalos or Kim Tallbear that talk about reorganizing the way that we think about society and being in ways that center the land, that center non-human beings, non-human relatives as well. And so I think that these type of conversations are the ones that, to me, bring a lot of joy and that I love to celebrate, because I think that those go a lot deeper than just trying to create, you know, some sort of legalistic equality that historically hasn't really done anything. We're still here discussing these things that have been discussed for literally centuries before. So I'm finding a lot of joy, and I think that that growth in that discussion of that dimension of the struggle is really, really important. And the concerning aspect to me is just, you know, the complacency, yes, but the co-optation as well. And that to me is really dangerous. And so that's what I'm mainly concerned about.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot of threads here that hopefully we will come back to, including questions about what does it mean to lift up Black voices? What does it mean to create a multi-ethnic, multi-gender coalition for change? And also these questions about how does one bring groups in while at the same time avoiding complacency, avoiding co-optation? Before we dig into some of those questions, though, I just want to invite you. We asked you to join this panel not only because of your insights and your intellectual capabilities to think about these concerns, but also because of your own experiences on the ground, so to speak, acting as a force for change. And so what I'd love to have you do is just pick one experience you've had in political action, however you want to define that exemplifies your beliefs about how, in particular, historically marginalized groups can serve as a catalyst for change. Julie, do you want to get us started this time?
Well, I'll pick one activity. Well, it's hard for me to pick one activity. I've been involved for a lot of years. I know how Indian politics works. I know how our Native people develop a priority, a task, and they take that from, you know, the local level to the regional level to the state level to Washington, D.C. I know how that works. I used to work for the Lower Elwha tribe, and my job was to secure research money on how to take down the Elwha dams. It was 1.6 million I had to raise, but it cost 350 million to take down 2 dams. I wish during that period that I knew how to work in a non-Indian community. I wish I knew how non-Indians set their priorities. So after I retired in 2008, and I've been busier than ever since then, I decided that I would join and become involved with the Democratic Party. I've been a Democrat all my life. So I went to the Clallam County Democrat meeting, and I become elected as a delegate. And it's a process. It's kind of like a basketball tournament. My husband was a basketball coach. So you win at the local level, the regional level, state level, so forth, you know, so that you get elected. And they only elect, I think it's 65 people, you know, through that process around the state. So I went to the Democratic convention in 2008 in Denver. And I remember talking to Senator Patty Murray, and I said, what am I going to learn here? She said, you're going to learn how to network. Well, I knew how to network in the Indian world, or my world. But when I came back, I decided I was going to study how non-Indians do their politics. You can read about it, you can go to class, but I was going to get involved in studying how non-Indians do their politics. How do they set their priorities? How does the county? How does a legislative district? How does the state? How does the national? And so that's what I decided to study. And I become a committee woman, elected committee woman for the Clallam County Democrats. And I vote for the county at the state meetings, 3 state meetings a year. They never had a Native woman do that before. Then I become the chair of the Native American Caucus. Now, when I started in 2009, I was with 4 other Indians in Spokane, Washington at a state convention. State Democratic. They said, Julie, we want you to be chair of our Native American caucus. I said, how many tribes are involved? Who's involved? And they looked at me and they said, just us. There was 4 of us. So I said, well, you want me to be the chair and I can boss you guys around? So I become chair. And now, according to the chair of the Washington State Democratic Party, Tina, we are the largest Native caucus in the United States. Since that time, we set our priorities. We've elected 9 people that we have right now in public office. Deborah Lekanoff is a state representative from your area. She's doing a great job. We have 6 Native people running now. Now you have to understand, I also work with Idaho and Oregon, running for Senate, for Congress, for a state senator, you know, in different positions. So we're supporting them. The other thing is I don't agree with this part, but I ran for electoral college, presidential electoral college 4 years ago. And I ended up being voted chair of the electoral college in Olympia. And I decided to run again. I'm gonna really retire pretty soon. But I thought I'd do this because we have to make sure, you know, the votes in Olympia. So what I've been doing, I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but, you know, studying how non-Indians set their priorities, how do they develop the priorities for the county, getting involved in that, getting other Indian people involved. I'm using the word I a lot, but we've had to get a lot of people involved. The Lummi tribe, they have some great outreach workers. They're, you know, getting people registered to vote. I think one of the most important things that we did was there were 9 public hearings held around the state, the United States, and one was in Oregon, which a group of us helped to organize. And there were 2 attorneys and 1 court judge that took testimony from Native tribes in the Northwest, you know, on the racism that they've felt, that they've experienced, you know, when they've gone to vote, you know, what's happened to our people. I mean, even a year ago, within this last year on the Colville Reservation, they didn't pick up the ballot box for 2 weeks. You know, what's the message there? You know, so the other thing is I'm getting very, very involved in is a redistricting of the legislative districts. You know, I've been studying how they do that. We need a Native person on that commission. And so we just passed a resolution with the 58 tribes in the Northwest, you know, supporting that priority. So I'm working on that. I worked on that today. So I don't know if you might know him, Brian Gladysby. Do any of you know him? You don't know him. Okay, he was the chair of the Swinomish tribe. He was on the council there for 30 years. He was chair for 26 years. He was chair of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. He was chair of the National Congress of American Indians. He's a great leader. And so we're supporting him to be appointed to the redistricting committee. We're also hoping that a Black person gets appointed. What happened on the Colville Reservation, one of our largest reservations in the state, they were split in half. The same thing happened on the Yakima Reservation. That can't go on. So I'm studying how all of this is done. I hope I answered your question.
No, I think you make an interesting point about this sort of a methodical, and what I'm hearing is a kind of a methodical approach to not just understanding how politics operate within the community that you were raised, but very consciously thinking, okay, what are the rules of the game in other contexts, and how do I learn to play that game?
How do we learn? I should be using the word, how do we learn to play that? You know, I'm so proud, you know, that we have Deborah Lekanoff, you know, as a state representative from the 40th legislative district. I didn't even know what all the initials meant. You know, like what's a PCO, precinct committee officer? You know, we had to learn all of that, you know, so we've got Deborah Juarez. The first time since 1869, we have a Native person elected to the Seattle City Council. The first time, you know, and that land there belonged to the Squamish tribe. Thank you for the opening statement, you know, about being on tribe, you know, sacred land. You know, we have highly intelligent people that need to be sitting behind those desks in Olympia and in Washington, D.C. I've been working I've been trying to get the Latinos organized in the 24th Legislative District. We have 14,000 Latinos. You know, they could be such a power horse, but they're treated so differently, you know, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Sahar, is there experience that you can tell us that from your perspective kind of exemplifies your thoughts about how one achieves political voice?
Sure, and I guess what I would just say is I have a 2-year-old resisting nighttime right now in the background. Promise
I can go to someone else,
child.
but we don't mind. I think my 10-year-old.
He likes to make appearances. So this one was an interesting one for me. I was sort of thinking about it, and with many of my colleagues who work in government, sort of sometimes playing the activist role in government, which may or may not be kosher. I ran for office like almost 8 years ago now. It's obviously I didn't win, and it's not something I love to talk about. But I ran on a platform around undoing racism, and then we really needed to talk about racism if we were going to see change. And the Seattle Times, I swear this is relevant, the Seattle Times didn't endorse me, not shocking, but they said if you ever want an advocate for immigrants and refugees in this race, Sahar would be your candidate. For that sentence ended up changing most of the trajectory of my career. I was recruited to then be the first policy analyst for the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs in the city of Seattle. And I had actually gotten the opportunity to help organize and advocate and write the legislation for that office. So it was really exciting to be recruited in. One of the things that office does regularly is sort of advocate for immigrant and refugee voice in a system that largely was created without considering their voice. The first program that I created was called the Refugee Women's Institute. It still exists. It was recognized by Obama in its first year for innovation. And the way that it came about was during the Seattle Police Department consent decree negotiations, there was a bucket of funding that was set aside for programming for anyone who could come up with something to help build trust between immigrant communities and police. And this had been after a number of really concerning incidents in the community. So I created an entirely new model, something that nobody had really conceived of before. We created a model that was an advisory board that was just immigrants and refugees. They came and advised me on what they wanted. We asked them, what would you want? Well, how would you build trust with this group of police officers, with law enforcement, right? People who have been pretty, have had some shocking behavior in the past. And they told me exactly what they wanted. And we created an entire institute based on what they wanted, and we flipped the power structure. And so usually the way city programming works, and most government programming, is that government officials come out and they sort of explain to you how government works, and it's your job to figure out how to navigate. And so we flipped it, and we had the refugees paid to teach the officers about what they wanted to teach them, what it meant to be respectful to a refugee in their community, how they wanted to be treated, what kinds of things they wanted to learn about. And the officers participated, and we kept this class going for, I think it was like 10 weeks total. Everyone got compensated for their time, which is still very controversial in government, and well compensated, right? Like $50 an hour, like not a small amount of funding that was sort of shortchanged. They were refugees who had been in this country for less than 5 years. And so it was a legitimate source of funding for them. And it meant a lot to the groups, both of them. They still talk to each other. We have a lot of data that we have kept ongoing. Program is ongoing. I still keep in touch with many of the refugees and the officers. They're still friends with each other. They go on hikes together. And they really just, I think for me, it was an opportunity where government decided to integrate community voice and listen to community voice and have a minute where the programming was actually what community wanted and responsive to what community wanted. There are a lot of things that government doesn't do well. And I am not going to be the first person here to sort of say they're the best things ever, right? Like we all know government often fails people. But the idea that that everybody was willing to put aside all of it, to work together to come up with how their community could be what they wanted it to be, and to lift up that voice and to integrate that voice and to change policies. Those policies, those ideas, those communications, the messaging, all of the ideas that those refugees came up with were integrated. The refugees came back to the officers and they said, you know, I walk into your precinct, I don't see anything translated into my language. Why would I think that you care about me? That summer, the officers paid for like an additional 20 different languages to be translated because they heard that. And I don't know that that is sort of the most shocking, most, you know, powerful change in the world, but it was something different for us in government, and something that I got to work on.
Thank you. Melina.
Yeah, I'm still trying to think through, you know, that question about of change. Just the word change, it's so broad, it's so vague too. But thinking about my own experiences, and I'm definitely coming from different experiences, obviously, than the other folks on this panel, but also I've never worked inside institutions. That's not, you know, my politics are working outside and with community and not necessarily trying to make institutional change. Although the politics that I have been involved in are seeking to create systemic change. And so when I think about whether those actions, the tactics, the strategies, if they were successful or not in creating change, I mean, the reality is I wish I could say that we did, but, you know, we're still here again, fighting for the same things that our ancestors were fighting over 500 years ago. And so while I do see, you know, we see some reforms in some areas, but when I take a look at where we are and try to reflect and, you know, meditate on my experiences in my work with community and as a professor with students, sorry, this question is it's so difficult. It's difficult for me, but getting back to it. So when I think about the systemic change, I would like to think that my work, you know, has made tremendous impact, but it really hasn't. And so when I think about and reflect on these things, I tend to focus more on the things that I've learned from, for example, Black feminisms, from Chicano feminisms, Indigenous feminisms, queer, disabled, women of color, and the ways that they view the world and help me understand the world. And when I think and focus on power and the relationships that are, you know, shaping the world and shaping these outcomes that we're trying to fight against, then that's when I can really see where change has occurred and change has improved not only my life, but the lives of the peoples that I work with and that I organize with. So for example, understanding my own oppression and understanding how that oppression is connected to the oppression of others, and to be able to trace the ideologies that are shaping that oppression, right? So white supremacy, settler colonialism, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, to understand myself as a colonized subject. And now as a professor, benefiting from the stealing of native land on which our university is sitting on. You know, so understanding all these things and having these realizations, I think that critical change that it spurred within me, I think that is really powerful. And so, you know, I'm not really sure who the audience is today, but that's something that I do want people to think about, that it might become heavy and difficult and tiresome to only think about systemic change and that we're not there. But when we listen, again, we're talking about voices, right? When we listen and learn from Black people, from all these people that I just mentioned, we can see that we can have systemic change. But if we don't address all the different ways that these ideas manifest and these structures penetrate our lives, including our own psyches, our own spirits, our own emotions, then systemic change is not possible, because it's all connected and all related. And so again, when I take a step back and I only measure my impact or, my experiences, my trajectory, just into this the overarching goal of systems change, then, you know, it makes me feel bad. I haven't really done anything, but I feel like the learning, the internal learning and helping students and, you know, everyone else around me understand these things, to me is really big change.
So political change itself can be about personal connections, both in personal understandings, but also facilitating in an interpersonal way, one's understanding of oneself and of others. Larry.
You know what? First of all, let me say, I think I'd like to be an undergraduate again and take a course under Melina. I think I would really learn a lot and enjoy it at the same time. There is a luxury in being old. Let me say that. As an old Chicano male, I'm going to kind of rely on my own history to answer this question, which is really a good question. And that is to say, when I look at the Latinx population, Chicana population, of which I am a part of, I have to go back to our cultural roots. And that is to say that when we talk about political change or social change, we have to really look at our cultura. We have to look at our familia. We have to look at our unidad. And when I say familia and unidad, and I think Melina and other people can vouch for this, I think Julie can vouch for this, we're really talking about extended family and extended community. Especially if you travel up and you become a professor in Washington, whatever, and you were born and raised in LA and East Los Angeles, you really have to create extended family and extended networks. So that has been a part of my life, even getting out as a young Chicano vet out of Vietnam. I was approached by, later on to become good friends. One was Raul Ruiz. The other was Rosalio Munoz, who were very active in Chicano politics at that time. We were all young. We were all in our mid-20s. They later formed the Chicano Moratorium and led a number of protests against the Vietnam War. As a Vietnam vet, they knew I just basically had been released from the Marine Corps, served my enlistment. And a week out from being a Marine in Vietnam, I was giving a speech in front of 10,000 people at the Chicano Moratorium because they needed somebody who had been in Vietnam to say something about the war and how Chicanos were utilized in the Vietnam War effort. So out of that linkage with Raul and Rosalio Munoz, I later became an editor for a newspaper in East Los Angeles. It was a weekly newspaper called Justicia O. And it was a newspaper that spoke about immigrant rights, tenant rights, environmental rights, as well as the Vietnam War and its impact upon the Chicano population. It was bilingual, and we had a circulation we thought was very good at that time. We had a circulation of just over 20,000 that we actually mailed out to. And we used to leave newspapers throughout East Los Angeles and Los Angeles at university campuses, as well as mercados, as well as panaderias, talking about issues that affected the Chicano population in East Los Angeles. The important part of that work is that we were also unified with other people across the country. We were in contact with the Crusade for Justice in Corky Gonzalez in Denver, Colorado. We are also in contact with some folks you may know, Willie Velasquez, who was the founder of the Southwest Voter Registration Drive Education Project out of Texas, later on out of East Los Angeles and Colorado. Also Jose Angel Gutierrez, that formed the La Raza Unida Party, and a person who was a very strong leader, Rosie Castro, who was from San Antonio, Texas as well. And so we had these linkages, and we knew what was going on in Denver. We knew what was going on in Austin and San Antonio. And we would carry news articles, and we would also support the many struggles that were going on in those various areas. Now, my life took a turn because I was very much wrapped up in East Los Angeles, went to undergraduate and graduate school at UC Santa Barbara, UCLA. But then some of you know that I ended up at Colorado State University in Colorado. Well, what was kind of interesting is before I ended up in Colorado, I had a series of different organizational meetings with those folks I just mentioned, Willie Velasquez, Rosie Castro, Corky Gonzalez, later on Federico Peña when I went to Colorado. And let me just give you an aside, and I'm going to say a little bit about Sahar and her 2-year-old, because basically Rosie Castro would always bring her twins to every meeting. She was a strong, powerful leader, but she would always bring her twins, and her twins were, at that time, I think they were between 9 months to a year old. And she called them Los Chillones. And Los Chillones in Spanish means the crybabies, okay? And I remember that people would say, well, why do you call them Chillones? She said, well, they're crying all the time. And he said, well, why do you bring them to the meeting? Well, I want them to become activists, that's why. And so what do you call those Chillones? He said, Joaquin and Julian. That's what I call them, Joaquin and Julian Castro. Rosie Castro was their mother. And of course, Joaquin became a congressman. Julian became mayor of San Antonio, later on became a secretary for urban and housing development under the Clinton administration. So yes, they did become activists. They went on in politics. But when I was in Colorado, Corky Gonzalez, Federico Peña, and I decided we really need to change the landscape of Colorado. And to do that, what we needed to do was to bring up Willie, to bring up Rosie, and to bring up Jose Angel, and do a voter registration drive very similar to what had taken place in Texas. And so we did bring them up for a series of conversations up to Denver, Colorado. And we set out a plan of action. Willie Velasquez was really the architect of this, because he was really the brainchild of the voter registration education project in Texas. And what we did is, in the course of probably a little more than 2 years, we got 80,000 new Chicanos registered to vote in the state of Colorado, which was amazing in those days, okay? We got them registered, ready to vote. And then the next step was to provide Chicano candidates that would run for political office. And so the first person chosen was Federico Peña, who later ran and became mayor of Denver, Colorado. Later on became secretary, I believe, Secretary of Transportation under Clinton. And so this was kind of amazing to get Federico elected, but we had to go further. We had to get other people elected. So we got many Chicanas elected on city council in Greeley, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, Denver, Colorado. And in Fort Collins, I became the person they said, you need to run for office. So I ran, got on the city council, later ran for mayor of the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. So again, when I look back at those years, formative years of my youth, I still think that it's really necessary to have that networking, to rely on those folks that you know can help you in whatever your struggle is, in whatever region of the country you might live in. It's good to have those networks viable, strong, and be able to rely on folks that have the expertise to help you. And that's part of familia. That's part of having an extended family, in my perspective. And certainly, in many ways, I think it has helped the Latino familia across the country in terms of their struggles for organization on different issues. So,
thank you. So, political scientists often talk about insider strategies and outsider strategies. So thinking about both mobilizing change either by working closely with political elites or by working outside the system, mobilizing mass publics to create pressure from the outside. I would love to hear a few perspectives on what you see as the merits of either of those approaches. Another way to think about this is, what's the value of working within a system that has historically failed to provide equal protection, even if it has in words or in legal language promised to do so?
I can talk a little bit about organizing a demonstration, but one of the things I want to share about being Native is that we live under so many different rules. We live under tribal rules, federal rules, like I don't fish, but then there's these state rules and government rules from Canada to America. Then we have the state, rules and the county rules. And so we live on all these different laws. I just want to, so maybe the good thing that happened because of that, and I'll just talk, when I saw the demonstrations in Seattle on Capitol Hill, when my husband and I were first married, we used to live on Capitol Hill, and he was going to college. We had a little tiny place. That building is still there, so, and we were married 54 years before he passed away. So, but there was a demonstration years ago in Seattle, and it was taken over Fort Lawton for the United Tribes of All Indians. Have any of you heard of that? Mm-hmm. So, and that was out at Fort Lawton. And I never realized this, but I think we were pretty well organized, because we really were networking. We had actually had the Seattle Indian Health Board, which was just a real small nonprofit health organization. They set up a booth in case anyone got sick. We had the American Indian Women's Service League bring the food in. We had another couple ladies write the press releases. And as I watched those demonstrators up on Capitol Hill, I thought, they are just not organized. They need to let everybody know what their priorities are. It needs to be documented, what they want to do. But that's what I thought about as you were speaking. And I remember, I don't know if I should share this, but one of the things that they wanted me to do was to get along with the federal people, and so I had a role, that, I met with a lot of the different elected officials and that sort of thing, to tell them, what they needed to do in a good way. But that's what I thought about when you were just speaking now. But I was, and now, United Indians they're still functioning today. They have a board, and I think they're doing a pretty good job. They're still, one of our goals was, when we were in Seattle, we wanted United Indians to become the education center, then the health board, and, would take care of the health. And the Seattle Indian Center at that time, we brought together 4 organizations and we purchased a building. It was the Second and Cherry building, and Henry Broderick owned it. And how we pulled that off, I look back and I don't know how we did that, but we did it. And then I left, and later on they sold the building, and the 4 organizations divided the money and built other buildings. But, I think, whenever you're going to be, I remember a militant, as some people called us. I remember I went and looked that word up in a dictionary because I wasn't sure, what the newspapers were calling us. And I thought, oh, I was so young then, and I didn't understand, that that's how non-Indians describe people that question things. And we didn't get violent or anything like that. But I was just thinking of those things when, they've had the demonstrations in Oregon and Capitol Hill. It just made me feel bad that they're not organized, and they shouldn't be allowing, the group of people tearing up the businesses and, destroying them. That's not good. I'll end there.
Okay.
Kate, I would just say that I think it's impossible to really have a movement unless you have it from the grassroots, as well as have people on the inside that can help with the movement. Whether you look at the Civil Rights Movement, whether you look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Brown v. Board of Education, all of that was really initiated by grassroots movements, and then getting additional support from the inside. If you look at the life of John Lewis, I mean, that's what John Lewis represents, somebody who led grassroots protests, demonstrations, but then learned also to work from the inside as well. So I think it's really difficult to bring about change unless you do both concomitantly and unified.
Mm-hmm. So I guess one question this leads is to what are the risks of kind of insider approaches, particularly in terms of either allowing one to be potentially co-opted, or allowing one to become complacent with a certain level of success. And I wonder whether Sahar or Melina, whether either of you would like to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the initial comments, co-optation is one of the things that I'm definitely concerned about, and that I think that we all should, be following and being involved in, and not allowing that to happen. And so kind of going back to the original question of the insider outsider strategies, to me, I always like to take a step back and question who benefits from posing these things as separate. Why does it have to be either insider or outsider? Why can't, as Larry, is discussing, and I agree, they should be insider and outsider tactics working together under a grander strategy of liberatory or revolutionary change. That's kind of how I see in the grander picture functioning. But I think the other dimension of this that I like to think about is that whenever I hear, political scientists, including myself in my earlier stages of my career, before I really started to dig more critically into what we're being taught in these institutions, is that to me, it assumes that people are coming to the game, understanding and consenting to the rules. And I don't think that, trying to pressure people, because that's really what it feels like, trying to pressure folks to choose which strategy to take is assuming that they find this government and its institutions legitimate, and that they have somehow consented to participate in this political process. And if we are indeed listening to the voices of people on the ground, they are telling us exactly the opposite, that they don't consent to being murdered, executed by state agents like they did to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, to all the people that we can keep naming, and all the nameless people, all the people that are, now in mass graves, all the people in concentration camps. Did they consent to these politics? So I think that we really have to start there. Why do we just assume that this is the way to, be politically active or to pursue change, and that we're all on the same, just on the same page? We really aren't. And I think that that's what the movement out in the streets, this massive, unprecedented social, political revolution, is trying to tell us, that these strategies no longer work. And I feel like a lot of people are not only being vocal about, not thinking that this government is illegitimate and has stolen, not just native lands and resources and enslaved people, but it has stolen generations of people. And so thinking again, insider versus outsider strategies, who benefits from this? And so I think about, for example, the immigrant rights movement. Back a couple of years ago, from 2015 to about 2017, there was a really strong movement in Southern California from queer and trans folks, asylum seekers and migrants, that were mobilizing out in the streets. They were blocking streets. They were, organizing protest politics, but they were also going to City Hall and pressuring local officials to shut down the detention center and to, provide safety for the trans migrants that were being held there. And they were successful. They shut down that detention center. And so they used both. And they were arrested and they were heckled at the council meetings, but they used both. But of course, we don't really listen to trans people or asylum seekers, very rarely. So these stories of successful organizing that merges these two tactics, they're not in the mainstream. People don't know about them. So this presentation of them as oppositional has a lot of traction because we don't know these histories.
Absolutely. And I think I appreciate what, in many ways, all three of you are saying, which is that the insider track and the outsider track, they're not mutually exclusive. They often can and do both historically and normatively complement each other. Sahar, as someone who is, at least in recent years, been mostly on the inside track, right? Trying to make change within the institutions you've been serving. What do you say to people who say that the system itself is so corrupted that there is no contract that underlies that we need to follow.
No pressure. Hell of a question. I mean, look, this is what just taking into what all of you are saying, and all of it is 100% right. And I, also want to go back to school and sit in both of the professors' classes and learn a few things. From my perspective, I think of this in a couple ways. The first thing I think about is the insider track only works because of the outsider track, right? It is for me as someone on the inside, we are functioning the way we function, even if it isn't perfect right now, because outsiders hold us accountable. That is the only truth that can be real. And so I think they are working together, and I don't want to lose sight of that accountability that needs to be there. I wouldn't have it any other way, right? Government is built for all the people, right? And so those people need to hold us accountable. It cannot just be us playing our own game on the side. The example that has been sort of playing in my head as we've been talking is, many of us were outsiders who sort of showed up in government and stayed for better or worse. So earlier this year, the beginning of the year, I'm sure some of you might remember that there was an incident. I'm Iranian and Muslim, and there was an incident at the border, Blaine, where some 60 Iranians were held and detained for 12 hours with no right to legal counsel and really no reason. And I was, the whole time that you've been talking, I have been sort of thinking about how that played out in my head, because that was an instance where the insiders in federal government went rogue, right? They decided what the law was. They decided what they wanted to do. I remember receiving a copy of what the government had sort of released as acceptable to detain. And that was like a description of me. Like you could have stopped me right there. And I was born in this country, and it didn't matter. And I remember that morning, it was a Sunday morning when we found out, I started getting phone calls from Iranians at like 6 a.m. Our friends are being detained. What do we do? And my boss, was like, you need to do whatever we can. Like, let's make noise. Let's figure this out. So we set up a strategy where we were working with all of the advocates to make this a news story, right? Like this had to be something that wasn't okay. And we had to sort of amplify voices that hadn't really been organized in this capacity before. But the piece that was really interesting is by noon that day, so not even 6 hours later, we held a conference call for the advocates. And as we started checking in, it was a bunch of advocates and a bunch of government officials who were from all of these different elections. I don't even know. I mean, I was one organizing the call, and I don't know where they came from. I don't know how they got the information, and it's fine. They wanted to help. They wanted to know what they could do to support, which was great. But it sort of reminded me that one, there are people on the inside and the outside who are working together all the time, and we can't really. We cannot sort of, I don't see how you change if you're not working together, which I don't think anyone else on this call really has suggested. What was interesting was that they were really letting the Iranians lead the conversation and telling them what to do. And I think that is sort of the model that I would like to see government adopt more, right? Like, how do we let the folks who are the most impacted actually lead? How do they break down these boundaries? How do they tell us what the processes are? How do they re-envision what government looks like for them? How do they rebuild? Tell us what to do to rebuild, or, actually be the ones who are working in government too, right? Like it doesn't need to be a whole bunch of people who are sort of homogenous in some sort of way. I think government works best when it is all the voices represented and working with the people. That's my government spiel.
This is Julie. Did you say you work for Bob Ferguson?
I do.
And then, so one of the things that's happened in Indian country is a lot of the different key people in Olympia have tribal liaisons working for them. And Asa Washington Have you met
Yeah, I
Asa?
recruited him.
Oh, good. Well, I was really surprised that a tribal liaison that Asa went and worked for Bob Ferguson, since there were 2 lawsuits that Yakima won against Bob Ferguson. Yeah. And so Indian country was really surprised. One of the concerns, though, and I think it's really important that we have people on the inside and the outside working together. We have over 30 tribal liaisons that work in Olympia. And I think, and it's one of our goals with the Native American Caucus that I'm chair of, is that we need to have Indian people hired into those positions. We only have 6 or 7 Indians, you know, and we have all these non-Indians that are working in these tribal liaison positions. And we need our own people. We have educated, qualified people that can do the job. And why I know people that have master's degrees, and they don't even get interviewed. And I haven't talked to the governor about that or some of the key people, but I will be. And I've been concerned about it for several years. I'm just saying.
Well, that's important. The people who represent should be from that community. That makes perfect sense to me.
It just bothers me that, anyway.
So we had a question from the audience. Luis Bueno writes, as a man, what's the best way to make women have equality? And I think I might expand this question to say, what does one, so he writes, what's the best way for someone who's not a woman to expand, to seek to further the cause of women's equality, right? We might broaden this to say, we've spoken a little bit about the benefits of a broad, diverse coalition for change, as well as, I think we've heard very compellingly, the value of particularly people who have been marginalized speaking for their own communities and being given context to speak on behalf of communities. What would you say, or what kinds of advice would you offer to someone who says, I'm a man, but I want to further women's equality. I'm white, but I want to further the cause of Black Lives Matter. What do you see as the role of, outside, I guess, a different kind of outsiders, right? But sort of outsiders versus sort of more homogenous, more unified sort of groups of those who have with lived experience.
Let me kind of respond to that, because I think that's a good question that's being posed. And I think you really have to have women on the ground floor of organization and decision-making at the very onset, whatever it is, whether it's a struggle, whether it's, trying to change a political landscape, you have to have women at the very beginning. And I say that as being part of the formative structure of the Chicano Movimiento back when, which was highly patriarchal. And you only had a few women. I talk about Rosie Castro, but she was one of only a few women that really was at the decision-making apex of the Chicano Movimiento at that time, when there should have been, more than 50%, because more than 50% was being done by women in terms of the grassroots of the Chicano Movimiento organization. So the only way that you can really counteract that is to have women's voices at the very onset of whatever you're trying to get accomplished. That's the only way it's going to happen.
I kind of want to respond to you, Larry. So just to build up to this, so Jose Angel Gutierrez, you mentioned him before. Mm-hmm. I saw him give a keynote speech about 2-3 years ago, and he stood in front of the audience. It was at a university, and he blamed Chicana feminists, lesbians, for basically the end of the Chicano movement. So I think that while we say that we need the voices of women in these spaces from the get-go, I totally agree. Don't start things and then invite people to them, right? You want them there from the beginning so they can help structure the path forward. But I'm using Gutierrez as an example because it's not enough to have people, to have their voices. It's also, again, that internal change, that patriarchy is still there. And so to answer the question that they pose, I also agree, it's a very good question. And I would, the follow-up to that is, well, how deep do you want to go? How much power are you really willing to give up? Because that's what it comes down to. If you're a man, you know, in your personal life, how do you treat the women in your life? Your wife, your children, your neighbors' kids, your children's colleagues at school, the cashier. That's the interpersonal level. Then when you get into the institutional, into your job, how are you treating your coworkers? When you're in a meeting and everybody's talking and one of your female colleagues keeps trying to intervene and they just do not give her space, are you going to allow that space, give her that space? Hey, she's been trying to say something. Or that was her idea. Simple stuff like that, right? But when we get to the structural, that's when we really have to think about our power and how much we're willing to give. Because if you really want to support women, for example, and there's so many examples, but coming from me, right? Chicana, immigrant background. If you really want to support Chicana women and support immigrant women, then you need to heed the call of the organizations that are asking people to lay their bodies on the line at the concentration camps, at the US-Mexico border, at Standing Rock when it happened, at BLM marches. Those are very difficult things to do. And so I think that when we ask these questions about how to support women, how to support Black people, Indigenous people, et cetera, you really have to be true to yourself about how much you are willing to give up. Because just saying, I'm going to bring you to this meeting and I'm going to listen to you, that's not enough. Not enough at all. Oh, no, and I think that today, I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, but that's what I'm adding to what you said, right?
Decision-making process all along the way. Yeah.
Yes. And so, again, really think deep, reflect how much power and how much discomfort am I willing to put myself through? Because that's what it's going to take to change things. Sure. And you know, the thing about this is that folks, I think when we think too much about the election in a very narrow way, we forget that climate change is right there. We really don't have time for reforms anymore. This is really the time for us to interrogate our power and how uncomfortable we are willing to put ourselves, you know, how uncomfortable we are willing to be through this process. So yeah, I'll just stop it there.
I concur.
Another question, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to invite everyone to answer every question. So if you do have something to say, I encourage you to jump in. Another question, I think in many ways goes back to comments that were made right at the beginning. I think, Sahar, you were the one who warned us of complacency. So I'm gonna try to combine two questions at once. I think a concern that we heard earlier, particularly earlier in the summer, one that you heard fairly frequently, was a worry that the mass mobilizations that we saw wouldn't translate into movement at the ballot box. You saw this, for example, the Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, speaking to protesters in Atlanta, said, you know what, you want to make real change, go home, go vote. So I'm gonna sort of throw two questions out at you. So the first question is, to what extent is this a false dichotomy, or to what extent is this something that you worry about? A second question, and this one comes from a panelist, or sorry, this one comes from an audience member who writes, you know, it's heartening to see all of the effort that we are seeing in people registering voters and getting candidates to represent those voters into office. To what extent do we need to worry that, as Sahar said at the opening, that we'll stop once the election ends, and that, you know, attention to policy issues once the elections have passed will subside? So along those lines, you know, are there strategies that you can recommend for how you keep people engaged, you know, both in the elections themselves and what comes after?
This is Julie. I'll just say one. I'll try not to take up too much time because I know we don't have a lot of time left. One of the things that we did, I mentioned that we held hearings, you know, regarding registration and the discrimination that a lot of our people felt because of language, because they didn't have a street address, just a whole bunch of reasons. And from that, the NARF lawyers, you know, did a report. But we also had a bill passed last year in Olympia, and it was a Native American Voters' Rights Act. So that if every tribe that wanted to have a ballot box on their reservation, the tribal chair, the tribal council would request for it, and one would be put on the reservation. That didn't mean that they would pick it up in time, so we're working on that. But that's one of the things that we've done. I noticed in the information that went out about this meeting that we talked about, Americans our Native Americans being able to become citizens in 1924, being able to vote in 1962. But in 2019, we passed the Native American Voters' Rights Act. Isn't that interesting that we had to do that just
Right.
last year? That's all I'll say.
Kate, let me kind of answer this.
I think Sahar was about to jump.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I don't. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt Professor Estrada. Go ahead.
No, that's fine.
Well, I guess the only thing sort of thinking about your first question a little bit more, I do think they are sort of different things. I think, and at the risk of sort of speaking on behalf of folks who are out there marching, to me, it is very different. The idea of voting to immediately change our current administration is different from a movement that is trying to address a lack of fundamental human rights since slavery. And I think we can go to the ballot box and we can vote. And this is, again, maybe more of a cynical side of me, but I don't know that is going to do anything about Black children that are being shot in the streets every day, right? That has been happening forever. No administration has dealt with that. And so I think in some ways, to me, it's it's so different to say that, if you want fundamental change, you need to go to the ballot box. I don't think that's real. I don't see that happening either way. That doesn't mean I'm not going to vote, right? Because immediate change is something that matters to me in this moment personally, and I will vote. And I think it is important to sort of recognize that we're talking about two very different things here. And I don't know if I made any sense at all there. It's getting late.
So that may be oversimplifying it. Larry?
No, I think, Sahar, you made a great deal of sense. I agree with your position. The thing we have to remember is that we can win a vote, but that doesn't mean we win the struggle. I still remember when Obama was ushered in as president. And I mean, with a multitude of many of you, I assume, were ecstatic just to see him take the podium as the incoming president of the United States. But I think one of the things that we should reflect upon is that whenever we win a vote, we should always be armed and prepared for the accompanying pushback that inevitably is going to come. And we should be ready for that pushback. And this is what I think we weren't ready for. I think many of us thought, well, maybe we reached a new stage with the election of Barack Obama, but we really didn't. And really the forces that have been with us, and I think Melina pointed to us, the forces that have been with us for 4 centuries emerged once again, okay? Because we weren't ready for that pushback. And 4 years we've been living with that pushback, I'll be very honest. So we have to do better in terms of when we win the vote. Yeah, we can win the vote, but that doesn't mean we've won the struggle.
And so then what does it mean? What does one do? I think these are really, really important principles. To someone who says, okay, I'm with you, I want to win the struggle. What's the next step?
The next step is you have to keep organizing. I mean, if you're just organizing for November 3rd, that's not going to make it. Right. You have to be part of organizing for the next decade in terms of really making change. And I think what happens, though, is, obviously we all get burnt out at one stage or another. But I think if you're dedicated to a struggle, you really have to give your uncompromised time for a great deal of time, much longer than just one election or a couple of elections. And I think that's, obviously, I point back to John Lewis, because, it was a struggle that he dedicated his entire life towards. And he knew it wasn't one. When he died, he knew it wasn't one. So again, I think we have to make some of that same dedication if we want to make true change within society.
This is Julie. I really agree with you, Larry. We have to find those people that have passion, that are going to make that commitment, that people that are going to run for public office, that are going to sit on the other side, that are going to help make us decisions. I've got a paper right here. These are people right here. You can't see it maybe. I don't know if you can, but these are 6 Native people that are running for public office. And the one on the bottom is 9 that are elected. We've got to elect our own people in those positions, but we've got to work both sides.
Exactly.
So I agree with you. We've got to find, and the other thing I want to say is I'm looking for volunteers. I'm volunteering. I'm not getting paid by anybody. We need to find volunteers that have that passion, that want equitable treatment for all people. I won't preach anymore, okay?
We have another question from the audience. Someone writes, as a law student, I'm interested in any insights you can provide, particularly how lawyers can serve as forces for equality and social justice.
Well, in Indian country, there's an organization called NARF. It's a non-profit organization, and it's made up of Indian lawyers. And they're the ones that took the testimony when we had our hearings regarding registration and voting rights, and have published now, and we're sharing that with everybody. But I'm sure every tribe can use an attorney, a volunteer attorney.
Thank you. Sahar?
Just as a recovering attorney, I don't. If you're gonna stick with the law, what I would say to you is there are so many amazing and unbelievable activist attorneys out there who are doing crazy work. Who I would if you are a new law student, if you're sort of looking to figure out your next step, I would reach out and sit down with them and understand. I think about Lisa Dogard at the Defender Association. I think about the attorneys at Colectiva. There are the ACLU attorneys, NERP, Northwest Justice Project. These are people who are in the trenches every day fighting for our basic rights. And if you decide to leave the law and you want to talk policy, I'm happy to chat with you about how to do that.
We are getting near the end. I'm going to give you each, I'll invite anyone who has 1 sentence or less to tell us when you look at where we are today versus where we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, what is one thing that gives you optimism? And here I'm going to be really strict on time because I don't quite have my clock to say it's a lightning 20-second round, but anyone want to give us a moment of optimism as we wrap up our conversation today?
Yeah, I can say something. I mean, I think to me, the youth are what gives me hope. Seeing them with such passion and such a drive, and I don't know, I can only think of swear words to describe their attitude, but that's what gives me hope, that they seem to understand the different ways that they can be co-opted and then they can't be manipulated, and they're rejecting that. And to me, that is what gives me hope and what I see as really important coming out of this.
Thank you. So I think that may be a good way for us to pull things together. I just want to say thank you all for your service, your efforts at making change, and your willingness to share with us your own perspectives on what makes it difficult to make change, what makes change look more possible, and how we break down all sorts of these dichotomies, whether it's kind of a division between the insiders and the outsiders, or divisions between, within groups that have thwarted mobilization and change. Thank you so much. I think, Judy, I'm going to pass it on to you. And thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you all. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you all the panelists, and thank you, Kate. You did another wonderful job emceeing this whole thing. And I'd also like to thank the audience for being with us tonight and for the insightful questions that you provided. What an evening. And you will be able to share this with your friends very shortly on the League website and on the websites of our co-sponsors, the museum and the Monroe Institute, as well as, I believe, on BTV. So I want to remind you of a couple of things. And one is that there is one more event in this series, and it will be coming up on November 10th at the same time. And that will be a virtual tour of downtown Bellingham, led by Dr. Josh Soretti from Western Washington University. And Josh has titled this tour, Bellingham, History from Below. And if you have ever wondered how Bellingham went from being 0% white people to almost 100% white people in 1 century, this is a tour you don't want to miss. And a spoiler alert, it wasn't an accident. Okay, and you can sign up to attend that event. There's a link in your chat box right now. So you can copy that, or you can wait to receive more invitations from us. You probably will. And it will also be listed on the website for the Whatcom Museum. And if you go to the Whatcom Museum website, by the way, you'll find some other really interesting stuff, fun online auction and some exciting online Halloween fun for children. So many great things in this town to do. And at this point, I thought I'd turn it over to Domani for some final parting words, if you are still here. Domani.
I am. Can you hear me?
Great.
He appears. Hey, thank you. We had a great panel last week, and I said, whoa, I wonder if we can follow it up with something equally as stimulating this week. And we did, because of my esteemed colleagues who held the floor tonight. And so thank you again. And I just want to very quickly, this has been very hectic fall for me, because these events were all supposed to happen in the springtime. And the Monroe Institute has its annual Monroe Seminar, which is the biggest thing we normally do. And that's coming up in just, what is it, Kate, 2.5 weeks or something like that? 2 weeks.
That's just 2 weeks.
2 weeks from tonight. And so some of us have been busy trying to get both of these things, you know, on the ground and running at the same time. But the Monroe Seminar this year, the theme will be the state of Washington in the time of COVID-19. And 2 weeks from tonight, on the 27th, our keynote conversation will be with myself moderating between Professor Alastair Roberts of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, director of the School of Public Policy there, and Professor Kyle Harper from the University of Oklahoma, Department of Classics and Letters. Don't let that fool you. He's writing a book right now about the history of pandemics, and his recent scholarship has been about pandemic and demographic change and so forth within the Roman Empire, going back, you know, to that era. So we hope that there'll be some nice contrast to their points of view about institutional stress in the time of COVID-19. And then we have a couple of panels on the next afternoon, October 28th, one on the bureaucracies, federal bureaucracies versus states' rights. Did I get that right, Kate? I tried to pull the template up, and my skills abandoned me. But the one panel is about bureaucracy and its responsibilities versus the rights of states and so on, and in the state of Washington in particular. And then the other one is going to be about the impact of COVID-19 on the Latinx population in the state of Washington, which is, as you all know, particularly been impacted by this pandemic. So 27th, 28th, and now that this event is over, you're going to see the big splash about those events coming up the next couple of weeks. I want to thank our panelists. And Melina is our junior colleague, and I'm like you, Larry, I'd like to sit in her classroom too. And Sahar, so good to finally meet you. Your reputation preceded you. And El Estimado, Don Laurencio, as usual. And Julie, I don't see you. I have a couple questions for you, and because I'm one of the sort of co-sponsors, they didn't get into the queue, but we know where to find you now. So thank you once again from everyone. Am I the last one speaking? Am I supposed to, let people go, or is that going to be Judy?
Say goodbye. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. This has been marvelous.
Thank you.